All right, everyone. Welcome to class online. I'm in my home studio where my web camera does not seem to be working very well and pauses all the time. So anyway, you'll just have to listen to my voice for this lecture. So today we're kind of covering a number of things, but hopefully you'll see how they all go together. We're going to be now moving into sort of modern times more, getting closer and closer to contemporary politics. And we've already seen that a number of these things are very important. War shapes society, shapes politics, shapes states, and so on. These are a number of other political sociology books. In the same series as your book for this class, one of the things that we'll be talking about a little bit more later are social movements and the role that they play in modern society in social rights. I think to provide a good background to understand what's going on and just kind of the state of things right now, looking environmentally, there was a famous bet in the early 1980s between the population ecologist Paul Ehrlich and the economist Julian Simon. And they were both interested in scarcity, population, natural resources. And Ehrlich, the environmentalist, said that, well, basically things are probably going to get more expensive because there's going to be less supply and more demand. Julian Simon said, well, actually things might actually go down in price because people will have to learn to use things more efficiently. Companies will have to learn products and raw materials and so on more efficiently. And so they had a big disagreement about the future of resources. They decided to put it to a bet. And they bet on, I believe, like 5 or 6 metals like copper and tungsten and a few others over the course of like 10 years or something like this. And at the end of it, it's very interesting. I often ask this in classes, and who do you think won the bet? And most people think Paul Ehrlich, the biologist, won. It's actually Julian Simon. They bet on like $2,000 or $3,000, so it was not an idle bet. So Simon, why this is important? It's not a complete truism. Doesn't hold true for necessarily all resources, but it's good to keep in mind that when faced with scarcity, humans can be very resourceful and, use our ingenuity. And in fact, he wrote this book, The Ultimate Resource, and the ultimate resource he's referring to is our ingenuity. So it's important for us to understand the possibility of scarcity, but also that scarcity can sometimes, motivate us to use things more efficiently, use resources more efficiently, which is very important for the health of our societies, for politics, and so on. Now, there's a tendency within political theory to fall for what the cosmologist Alfred North Whitehead famously called the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. This tendency to see abstract concepts as concrete entities. So some of the best ways to think about this are when analyses of capitalism, often pro-capitalist or anti-capitalist. There's a tendency to often maybe not explore the economy as it exists, but kind of explore the theories that try to explain the economy, and particularly the political economy, how politics and the economy go together. We think in terms of concepts, so in some way it's difficult to escape this, but we should always be aware of the theoretical approaches that we're using to explain existing phenomena. So big topic today then is globalization, and this is happening in the context of greater social rights. So as nation states generally are providing more rights to their citizens, some of it is happening as a result of globalization, the globalization of social rights, of civil rights, and things like that. Globalization generally means interdependence. Roland Robertson says, the processes by which the lives of all people around the planet become increasingly intertwined, along with our awareness of such interconnections. And this has a huge impact on our political scene. So there's a lot of unease about globalization, about the global economy, both on the political left and the political right. I think throughout most of my life, it's mainly been the political left that has been sort of in the streets and agitating against global capitalism and so on. Whereas it's been more recently that the right has become a sort of prominent critique of the global economy and global political economy. Here, not coming from necessarily a critique of capitalism, but rather from the standpoint of nationalism, so populist nationalism. And so you see, many countries in Europe, the United States, many countries that have benefited quite a bit from the global economy, are sort of wary of the changes that could be produced. And we see this especially when we talk about immigration. And many societies around the world are sort of dividing into sort of two camps: those that are more welcoming of migrants, and those who want to build walls and make restrictions. And as in the United States, many of these things are happening within the same country, which raises a number of questions. So, as we talked about trade a little bit, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time sort of reiterating these things, but globalization, it's hard to date when it began. The current phase of globalization, you could say, began after the Second World War, but trade, as we've talked about, has connected people for quite some time, across long distances, as the most famous trade route being the Silk Road. Silk Roads would be the more accurate way to put it, which, from its far eastern point in Japan, really, congealing in China, and then going through the Middle East and Central Asia and over to Europe. This went through most of the major cities of Central Asia, most of the major cities and economies of Southeast Asia, through parts of the Middle East, and as I said, into Europe. All the way to England on the other side, the other island, sort of the kind of mirror image of Japan and Southeast Asia. Now it's when it gets sort of linked to the spice trade, and then you get the seafaring voyages to try to get to the East Indies and so on through different routes. And this really changes the world, because the Europeans, they really like spices. Spices can do a lot of things. They can make food taste better, but they can also help preserve foods or meats, I should say, for a bit longer than may be the case otherwise. In the Netherlands, I can't remember if I talked about this, but the Netherlands, they'd sort of develop in this sort of global trading environment, and many of the cities are kind of their own sort of political units, and they have this contract of correspondence where they basically kind of make sure that they're working together for the most part. A lot of it's mediated by market forces. Then, of course, you have Britain and the British Empire. They have the British flag here, and you have all the peoples of the world, and wider still and wider shall thy bounds be set, basically saying that, it's only a matter of time before, the British Empire encompasses the world. There used to be a saying that the sun never sets on the British Empire, because, the British Empire was really global, and so there's always sun shining somewhere, in some colony. Today, you could say that the sun never sets on the U.S. military. There are 800 military bases that we know about around the globe, and there's always sunlight shining somewhere on the U.S. military. one of the sort of system that develops here is something called mercantilism. So this is essentially where the state, really directs the economy. It's not necessarily communistic, but it basically does a lot to protect, the home companies. So this is the logo for the East India Company, one of the first global corporations that in some ways more or less ran India for a while. And so you would have the colonies, where the gold and silver and commodities would come from. They would go to the home country, where they would be sold at higher prices as manufactured goods, and those would go back to the colony, and you start to get the emergence of this globally connected system. A great book that came out a few years ago about the East India Company, the anarchy, the East India Company, corporate violence, and the pillage of an empire. As I said, they, essentially ran India for almost a century. You have one of the, members of the Indian Raj, and you have, I believe that's King James down there, being represented in the artwork of the time. You also had companies coming from the Netherlands, other companies. This word that's impossible to, this name that's impossible to pronounce unless you know Dutch, I believe. I'll just go with the initials VOC. Same with the French one, CIO. But these are some examples of these companies, these mercantilist relationships that countries had with companies. I think I actually went over this already. Move on. So in France it was a little bit different. The system didn't work quite as well there. They needed those, to hold up those corrupt venal offices, which we talked about in the French system, where they would just give offices to people, to get them to shut up and, not start a revolution or something like that. So all of this ended up in kind of limiting the power of mercantilism within France. Now, one of the, kind of best analyses of the sort of period of capitalism was by Lenin. I'm personally not a big fan of Lenin. I think he caused more harm than good, but he did write some good things. One of them is this book, Imperialism, where he talks about how, the spread of capitalism wasn't like this, this harmless spread where people, adopted it because it seemed to be the best system. No, it was forced on people by a gun. And Lenin basically argued that imperialism, he says, this is this sort of monopoly stage of capitalism, where, the form of capitalism is imposed upon many other parts of the world. A more developed theory of global capitalism is world systems theory. This was something that I was really into when I was an undergraduate, developed by Emanuel Wallerstein. Wallerstein was studying Africa in the 1960s, and according to the model at the time, I think I have it actually described later. I'm going to go all the way down because I do want to. After the Second World War, there's this Walter Rostow, famous economist, and he comes up with these stages of society. Remember, a lot of problems with stages, but so he has traditional society, bartering, subsistence, and then there's a transitional stage where you have surpluses, you get the development of agriculture and so on, and infrastructure. Then he calls it stage 3, where you have a takeoff. You get industrialization begins to happen, and as a result, you have political change. Then stage 4, a drive to maturity, as economies are looking more like Europe, essentially, in Western Europe, I should say, in the United States. They're less dependent on, say, one commodity like oil or coal, and rather they have a diverse range of products and goods and resources that they're working with, and so on. They rely less on imports, and they have greater investment. And then you get stage 5, high mass consumption. This is, a lot of modern Europe and, parts of Southeast Asia, the United States, and so on. But again, the idea is that, there's this stage, there's these nice stages that people pass through, and so on and so forth. Okay. So Wallerstein, is working at the time looking at Africa, and he's noticing that it's not going, as Rostow said, that, there wasn't, these stages, they just didn't work. Not only was he, just not seeing it, not seeing countries go, not seeing countries go up these stages nice and neatly, but rather these stages didn't even happen in some cases. He was looking at Africa, and he was wondering, okay, why is it that they're not going up to the next stage and the next stage after that? It became pretty clear to him that, the reason was because of the world system as it was organized. So he developed this model where you have the core countries and then the periphery countries. The periphery would be many African countries, South American countries, Middle East, parts of Southeast Asia, and then the semi-periphery countries would be sort of middle-range countries that are not just dependent upon an export like, say, Saudi Arabian oil or the Congo and rubber and so on, but rather, they may be dependent on a few resources, but they may have some homegrown industries that they're developing and so on. So they're not just being exploited. Essentially, the core countries are just kind of exploiting the periphery countries, using them for cheap labor and raw materials. So I think a good example of this today is the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which I'll give a lecture on, just focusing on that because it's so important. That's where most of the world's coltan comes from. Coltan is a resource that's mined and is absolutely crucial for modern electronics, modern computing devices. So we have been, essentially almost using slave labor to provide us with the resources so that our computers and so on work. So I think this is a useful way. It doesn't work completely. It's some countries don't. Some are almost core and semi-periphery. But it's a good way to at least understand some of the basic relationships between some of the different powers. I didn't talk about Latin America, and I just wanted to briefly go over Latin America because the history there is important in terms of the history of capitalism. Unlike Africa, Africa was colonized in the late 1800s by Europe. This Americas started being colonized back in the 1500s, so you have a much longer history of European involvement. And at first it was just basic exploitation. They were just getting grain and meat and certain goods from these different countries. We had talked about the Habsburgs before. If you remember, they were the empire in the Austria-Hungarian Empire, and they essentially ran the Netherlands as well as Spain. But over time, this was they were becoming overstretched, and they weren't really able to monitor, say, what the conquistadors and what was going on in the new Spanish colonies in the Americas. The Habsburgs, they rewarded the conquistadors with these encomiendas, or encomiendas. I'm not sure if I'm actually pronouncing that right. Anyway, important point is that these are rights that were given to so essentially rights that were given to the conquistadors to more or less take the gold and silver and use Indians for forced labor. Over time, the elites in the Americas became more important, and they ended up pocketing a lot of the wealth. So the social class pyramid in the Spanish colonies, you have a lot of intermarrying going on over the next several centuries. Essentially, you have the peninsulares, which are the Spanish aristocrats, the Creoles, which are descendants of them, the mestizos, which are the mix of Caucasian and Indians, the mulattoes, the Caucasian and Africans. You had a lot of African slaves that were brought over to the Americas. Actually, it was about 5% of slaves were taken to North America. 42% were taken to Brazil, just Brazil. Another 38% were to the Caribbean islands. And then, a lot of the rest were taken to other parts of South America. So a lot of the villages, for example, in the eastern parts of South America look like parts of West Africa because it's primarily black residents. And the villages look more like West African villages than, say, villages of indigenous people in Chile or Argentina or Venezuela or something like that. Then you had the Native American Indians, and then at the bottom you had the African slaves. So for a long time, you had this sort of conflict between the agricultural and the mining elites. And they were pretty comfortable with their position. They didn't see a whole lot of need to mechanize. Similarly, the American South, the slave owners, they sort of prevented mechanization there as well because they just had their slave labor work. I'm reading a book about the Confederacy right now. It's very interesting because it kind of talks about their ideology. And, they were imagining this sort of slaving empire going from the American South all the way down into South America, where they would be essentially, enslaving everyone who is not white. And then, this kind of plays out differently in different countries. So what this does, and I just want to give an example. This is, an example of colonialism, and I think, it's important to understand the last 400 or 500 years were really characterized by European imperialism, European colonialism, the spread of capitalism, and so on. One of the greatest critiques of capitalism and the way in which colonialism and imperialism impacts, the people in which they're colonizing. One of the best accounts of this is The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon was born in Martinique, an island in the Caribbean. Picture of him right there. He went on to live in France for a while and then went to Algeria. And in Algeria, which was a colony of France at that time, he set up his psychotherapeutic practice there. And what's very interesting there is he had patients who were both French colonizers as well as people who were Algerian colonized. So, in the morning he would, be talking to a patient who had been tortured and would be talking to him about his trauma from torture. And in the afternoon he would have a French colonizer who did torturing. And he would talk to him about how torturing people negatively affected him, So Fanon got this very, very unique perspective, this position, this insight into the mind of colonization, both from the colonizer and the colonized. He has some great works on this, his psychotherapeutic approaches to clinical work, and then his psychiatric writings, which I think are quite interesting. Well, to sort of, sorry, I didn't get this. I'm not updating it now, but okay. I'm using my Penn State computer at the moment. Okay. Moving on. So, Frantz Fanon is writing in the 1950s about colonization, and basically imperialism and colonization are just continuing apace until the First World War. That kind of, disrupts Europe quite a bit. And then you have the Second World War, and essentially the colonial powers come to an end. Not right away, but they kind of gradually give up their colonies. And in some ways, they're forced to by nationalist movements, by independence movements, and so on. After the Second World War, though, it's very important that we understand the system that's set up. So John Maynard Keynes, important economist, helps to develop some of the institutions that really kind of hold the capitalist system in place and the political economy in place. The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. The World Bank provided loans to poor countries, while the International Monetary Fund also gave loans to poor countries, but also gave assistance for, assistance for infrastructure. For whatever reason, that did not make it into the slide. But dams, especially hydropower dams in Africa. And there's a case to be made that they gave out too many loans, or loans that they didn't really. They sort of assumed that, build a hydropower dam and voila, you would have, capitalist power and capitalist economy and so on. And that way you could pay back the loans easily. Well, that didn't happen. A lot of countries, especially in Africa and Latin America, fell into debt because they were still being exploited in that sort of world system. And a number of the World Bank and the IMF a number of years ago actually forgave a lot of debt, basically saying, these loans were not given in good faith, and it reflected the colonial relationship more than anything else. And so a number of countries have been able to, at least be freed from that. The main political organization at the end of the Second World War is the United Nations. And you also have at this time the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is very important. It's sometimes forgotten about, and it's part of this ideal that comes after the World War, where basically we're not going to do this again. We're not going to allow genocides or these destructive wars and so on. And we're going to take these Enlightenment ideals that have been sort of enshrined in political systems in the United States and France and elsewhere, and we're going to, kind of recognize it as more of a universal set of rights. And it's been a struggle ever since then, I think, to enact the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because immediately you have global power struggle, and human rights, they kind of fell by the wayside as both the Soviet Union and the United States essentially divided the world up in two, and would be more willing to recognize the rights of certain countries if they were willing to join one side or the other. And so unfortunately I think the potential for long-lasting peace and so on after the Second World War, it just doesn't happen, because you have all these wars break out around the world, and they're essentially between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, or the U.S. and China, or in some cases the Soviet Union and China, but they're fought not directly between these two countries, but through proxy forces. In some ways, the U.S. is fighting fighting Russia right now, but through Ukraine, which, well, we'll get there. So as I said, you have these stages of growth and these academics developing these different ideas, and they don't, as I said, they don't really work out. The world systems model for all of its problems. I think it's a much more realistic view of the world than expecting countries to go through these different stages. And for the most part, we've spent a lot of time demolishing stage ideas, so we can move on from there. Some of you have no doubt heard the term neoliberalism. This sort of develops in the 1970s. Sort of a history here. So liberalism, in its broadest sense refers to free market, free expression, the freedom to vote, all of these different things. And liberalism was basically connected with a capitalist economy. It was seen, not having the government control the economy was seen as a type of freedom. One of the major theorists of neoliberalism is Milton Friedman. He's often described as a libertarian, but he actually said that he considers himself more of a neoliberal. You think that's a more accurate description of him than as a libertarian. So neoliberalism it's made into, there are a lot of academic theories that describe what we now call neoliberalism. Early on, we get someone who comes along in the early 1970s, Augusto Pinochet in Chile. So in 1972, Chile has its first democratic election, and they made the mistake of electing a socialist. Salvador Allende, Allende, democratically elected. He was overthrown by Pinochet and probably the CIA. He ended up, committing suicide as, his compound was being surrounded, and he probably would have been tortured. So, people have called him a coward, and I hardly think that's fair, given what he would have, the horrible death he probably would have had if he would have killed himself. There's a long record of torture that happened under the Pinochet regime. Pinochet, in the mid-1970s, he attracts all these economists from Chicago. There's a Chicago School of Economists, not to be mistaken with the Chicago School of Urban Sociology, which was a few decades earlier. But anyway, the Chicago School of Economics, they were really into free markets and neoliberalism. And they essentially go to Chile and turn it into kind of an experiment. And they get a lot of aid and so on and so forth. And Chile's economy does better. It does well for a while. He rules until 1990. He has an election, and we've got to give credit where it's due. Usually when autocrats, dictators have elections, they don't mean anything. Think Vladimir Putin's elections. Pinochet had an election. He lost the election, and he gave up power. He went away. Well, didn't go away, but he was no longer in power. That's, as I said, not something dictators usually do. Okay, so later on in the 1970s, Margaret Thatcher is elected as the first female prime minister in England. She takes a radical approach. She privatizes a number of industries in Britain, such as the railways, and pushes through a lot of free market reforms. A couple years later, Reagan is elected, and in many ways follows suit and kind of follows the same ideas and so on. And by the end of the 1980s, you have the Soviet Union is in decline, both from Afghanistan, Chernobyl, and just a system that had been rotting for decades, since Stalin at least, if not from the very beginning. So in 1989, you have the fall of the Berlin Wall, which had separated East and West Berlin. East was communist. In Prague, in the Czech Republic, you have widespread protests in what's called the Velvet Revolution. And then in Russia, in 1991, you have widespread protests, and when the Soviet state comes to an end. Had an attempt to do the same thing in China in 1989. Students tried in Tiananmen Square. It did not work out. I'll talk more about this picture when we talk about China. It's kind of important historically. But basically you have the square, Tiananmen Square, where a number of students are protesting, and the military is brought in, and importantly the military from a different part of the country is brought in, and they start shooting, and we don't know how many students were killed. Serious estimates range from a few hundred to a few thousand. Interestingly, today the current president of China, Xi Jinping, his wife is a singer, has several major albums. Anyway, she played a show at Tiananmen Square for the troops after this, a few months or something after this massacre had happened. Okay, going on with history, so you get into the 1990s, Bill Clinton, the era of Bill Clinton, and you have the stock market just climbing. Now, it falls not because George W. Bush becomes president, but rather because it's basically what must go up has to come down. You have the dot-com bubble, a bunch of internet companies that didn't really have any plan for how they were going to make money, and that kind of fell apart, and you have a bit of a crash, and you start to see it rise again until the housing market crisis of 2008. Alan Greenspan, major promoter of this free market economy of neoliberalism. If you're familiar with the libertarian theorist Ayn Rand, he was kind of a disciple of her. When he was sworn into office, Greenspan brought Ayn Rand with him. Ayn Rand was a very outspoken theorist of capitalism, of the positive aspects of capitalism. And you get, as I said, you get the 2000s and the election of 2000, which is contested, and where Al Gore wins the popular vote, but George W. Bush wins the electoral vote. And as we know, that's what matters in America, and he becomes the president. And I'm not going to go through the last 15, 20 years or whatever. Just to say that, one of the big story, I think, right now, obviously, is not just the rise of Trump, but rather the rise of sort of populist nationalism around the world, in Brazil, and in many European countries, and India, and so on and so forth. And, of course, the spread of COVID. COVID hits the world economy and the world's political system, and has affected in ways that we still are still just beginning to unravel and understand. At this time, it's still pretty clear that despite the fact that, the U.S. leaves Afghanistan in this sort of undignified way and this kind of chaotic retreat, still there's no country that, comes close to the military and economic power that the United States does. China is very powerful, and China is growing in its power, but it doesn't have the same influence, and in many ways it's limited geographically with what it can do. The important thing to think in terms of geopolitics about the United States and the advantage that it has is that there's no other major country in the world that has such long shorelines on both the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean. That means that the United States can deploy its forces around the world much more rapidly than any other power. As I said, it's something that should not be underestimated. This does raise the question about the West then. What was the West? I read the conservative, somewhat aristocratic writer Oswald Spengler, I should say, The Decline of the West. If you read it, a lot of people think that the decline of the West is caused by other countries that are not in the West or something like that. And Spengler's saying, no, it is the West, actually, that it's within our own, it's within how would I describe it? Within the structure of the West, that will inevitably lead to its own decline, its own kind of overemphasis on technology over morality and stuff like that. Sorry. Oops. So, as I said, one of the things that's characteristic of the West, though, is the universalism, and here, the spread of individual rights. So while the U.S. and Europe and so on have been very contradictory and denied rights to certain people in practice and so on, the ideal of individual rights, of human rights. This is this universalist idea, and it's really, comes out of the Western tradition, at least in its modern manifestations. So when we think about, say, what's happening in Iran right now, for example, that's a good example of this. A desire to have those types of rights that have characterized the West. The right to wear a hijab incorrectly and not have to die as a result of it. As I've said, China, we'll spend more time on China, but I think I do have to kind of go over some of this to understand the world that we live in now. So China, there have been several rulers in China's recent modern history. The three most consequential, Mao Zedong, who you're probably familiar with because he kind of, led the Chinese Revolution, or led, I should say, the Communist Revolution and the Communist conflict in the Civil War, led the Cultural Revolution, and ruled China with an iron fist for a few decades, followed by a few other rulers, and then along comes Deng Xiaoping in the late 1970s. Deng Xiaoping is important because he recognizes some of the problems that were in China's communist economy, and he basically opens the door to Western investment, and opens the door to China being a partner to the West, to build factories there, and eventually to join the modern capitalist economy. Now, Xi Jinping in some ways embodies both of them. As I said, we'll talk more later, but in some ways he's trying to bring back some of Mao's ideas about the Communist Party and the power of the party. It's an interesting 8-part podcast that the Economist magazine has been running, specifically on Xi Jinping. Very, very interesting. As I said, we'll talk more about him when we get to China. So, let's see, I think I got a slide out of order here. I'll return to this later. So when we look at the world, as I said, this world system where Africa is basically being exploited for the resources and labor. And then there's another type of exploitation, and that's this aid that has been given to Africa. Dambisa Moyo argues that in this book, Dead Aid, that it's not working, that a lot of the aid goes to corrupt government and so on, and, doesn't get to the people who need it. And she says that actually the best way to help people in Africa is for places like the United States and Europe to drop their trade barriers, their tariffs, allow African farmers to compete with American farmers without American farmers having the aid that they get. She's basically saying you need something like a free market, and that would actually be closer. That would actually be closer to an equitable relationship. More recently, she's started to look at the role of China and how China is, kind of putting its flag in different parts of the world, where they have influence, and oftentimes these are places where there's a lot of resources. Get some idea of what's happening. I mean, this is 1996. This is the place where, China's import source number one in 1996 was just the tiny country of Gambia. And it's like a really small country. When you get roughly, not even today, just, a few years ago, and you've already got a lot of sub-Saharan Africa as well as most of Northern Africa. So, and it's actually grown since, 2015, 2016. So China is we'll talk about China more, but China's economy has been growing and becoming very diversified and interesting. A lot of people in the United States think that the biggest online retailer in the world is Amazon. That's actually incorrect. It's Alibaba. Sells, you think of like Amazon plus Twitter plus a few other things, and that's kind of what Alibaba is. Now, talking about the great powers, one of the things that I do want to talk about as we're talking about nation states and rights is the United States and environmentalism. because this is something that's really global. But it started out in, the modern concern for the environment and attempts to do something about it. Start out with in the United States with a lot of government policies, and then there were more global policies and treaties and so on later. But you get all these different rulings by courts or government legislation, the Endangered Species Act, the World Wildlife Fund is set up, and so on. All these different things that help sort of create the environment for environmental action. And then over time, the United States actually, the environmentalists, I should say, and activists in the United States push the nation to, try and work more globally as well. And really in the last, few decades, there's been a lot of international work on this. Slide was supposed to go back there. So what that's meant more recently is that the American government is getting more involved in things like energy production and things like this. So where our subsidies go, we have a lot of government subsidies for wind power, nuclear power, solar, and so on. A lot of our electricity is still coming from coal and nuclear and places like this. This is from 2010, so this is actually a bit out of date. We're getting more from natural gas than coal, actually. And we're getting more from solar. I think that's the interesting story of the last few years, is that the price of solar has just plummeted. So we could actually see it change. So my research, I looked at urban development and was looking at places that were trying to do sustainable projects. And this is one of the projects I looked at in Oregon, near Portland, Oregon. And what I found is that it's very complicated. It's not simple. For a long time, the government has been funding developments like this. And this is an aerial view of Santa Maria. Santa Maria has its beautiful parts, but it's also a very sprawling city. So urban sprawl is this, usually one, single family homes spread out across, large areas. And it eats up resources, eats up land. It's really not a sustainable way to live, to build. Now, there are a lot of things that go into this that people don't think of. One of the most important things that I've learned about in my own research was how important parking is. Something we don't usually think of, but it really determines everything. For a developer to build, say, an apartment complex, they have to provide parking. And if they provide parking, if it's, say, on, surface parking, that means that, some of their parking spaces are probably going to mean that they can build less. Every apartment gets like 2 spots or something like that. Well, you can build underground, build, basement parking units, but that's very expensive. You have to be a fairly good, well-endowed company to do that. So there's lift systems as well, and so on. Oops, sorry. So, in my book, kind of one of the things that I say is that, okay, so for us to build more sustainable developments, we have to figure out something to do about parking. That means probably subsidizing developers so that they can build parking underground. So anyway, that's a big role for the government there. If we look at more locally, these are urban areas or statistical areas. You have rural areas, and then what we call the frontier areas. So the environment plays a huge role in what can be built in California. And so the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, is a law that was passed in the 70s, and it requires an environmental impact assessment on every building project. And sometimes these can be used to knock down projects that were going to be very disruptive to the environment. Sometimes they're used by people who don't want to see an apartment complex with low-income people near them. and they'll find something that may violate CEQA. Zoning ordinances, these are determined by governments. The first one in the United States was in LA. Germany really developed modern zoning, but this is basically how governments decide how space is to be used for residential, commercial, industrial, or new categories like mixed, flexible spaces. The only major city in America without zoning laws is Houston, Texas. Houston, Texas has a lot of private deeds between neighborhoods and stuff like that. Someone has said that if you counted those as regulations, Houston, ironically, would be the most regulated place in America. So there's things that can be done like infill, where governments will look at, lots basically and find, this is in Ventura, this project here. We'll find places where the land is not being used, and they'll tell developers, hey, here's some open land for you to build on. And this will allow for a number of things. You don't need to know all this, is kind of technical, but as I said, the politics is getting very interesting. I believe I mentioned the home voter hypothesis. I'll mention that again. But that's this idea that homeowners, they don't want to see, affordable housing being built or, apartment complexes and so on, because those could negatively affect their own property values. That's usually the motivation there. Now, as I said, sometimes though, NIMBY has, not in my backyard, has actually done a lot to protect a lot of sensitive habitats. And in its most, in the way that has often been used, it has been to prevent, negative development. Now, there's a question though, is it wrong for people to oppose, say, affordable housing if it is deemed incompatible with the local environment? A lot of people feel that they don't want bureaucrats and politicians pushing things onto them. So Eleanor Ostrom, she was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in Economics by showing that, sometimes governments and big companies aren't the best in terms of figuring out resource use. Sometimes it's the people who live on the ground. So I've looked at, this is maybe if you're interested in Santa Barbara. So Santa Barbara uses a population cap at around 90,000 and other building caps to manage growth. They have an urban limit line that's kind of this boundary where growth can happen. At the end of the day, though, they've got these growth boundaries called the ocean and the mountains. So, it's kind of limited in terms of what they can do. So this is basically coming straight out of my research. If you want to have a developer build sustainable affordable housing, you kind of need both sticks that are going to be somewhat restrictive, but also carrots, incentives, tax credits, bonuses for building at higher densities, and so on. So one of my questions right now, that I'm interested in, that we'll kind of return to is, okay, so we have local politics of land use and things like that. What about the civil conflict that is happening about, our history, what gets taught in schools, or, how government should be represented, and so on. I have some questions about how we move forward when there's, 2/3 or something of Trump supporters think there's going to be a civil war. Now, what does that mean when we're trying to work on problems together? Can we work on problems together in this environment, or is civil conflict inevitable? There's a lot of evidence to suggest that we're moving towards a collapse of a complex society, and so on. If you read the literature of collapse, it's you can see some of the signs in our own society. At the same time, I don't think it's set in stone yet, and we can do a lot to probably make our governments better before falling into the mindset that we are inevitably bound to a civil conflict of some sort. All right, everyone. Well, I will leave it there and continue on Thursday.